behavioral dynamics in forecasting, and I'm going to talk about judgmental forecasts and scenarios in particular. The first ISF that I've ever been to was as a PhD student, where I was doing my PhD at University of Minnesota. It was 1987 in Boston, actually, and where I presented my first judgmental forecasting work. And I remember there weren't that many judgmental forecasting talks at all at that time. And then the next time I've been to was in Pittsburgh. And that was 91, I believe. Yeah, I think 91. And that's where I got to meet a lot of people that were doing my kind of thing all of a sudden. That's where I got to meet Paul Goodwin, who's just been my wonderful collaborator through the years on this journey. Of course, Michael Lawrence was there. Mary Thompson, Peter Ayton, and it was just like, wow, there are other people who are doing similar work, and that was great. And I've been coming to ISFs, not every year, but throughout a lot. And it's wonderful to see the surge of interest in judgmental forecasts, and recently in scenarios as well. So today I just want to take you on that journey and talk about some of the important concepts, I think, and looking at some of the things that I did and some of the things that I will be doing, and to basically share those experiences with you and the work, and get your comments, really. So I'm going to talk about AI and algorithmic advice. Then I'm going to relate that to judgmental interventions in forecasting, talk about the role that trust plays, and then scenario forecasting synergies, and talk about some of the next steps. That's the basic flow of things. So to start, I want you to sort of relax, get out of this symposium mode, and imagine a time flip scenario, right? This is sort of like a Benjamin Button going back to future kind of thing. So imagine that all the forecasts in your companies, organizations, have always been fully automated. They are generated by your systems, AI of some sort, whatever, and they've always been that way, always been that way, right? Would we invent adding a human touch, do you think? I'm very anxious to get your thoughts on that. Do you think we would invent adding some kind of a human touch to those system-generated forecasts, if that has always been the case historically? How many of you say, no, we wouldn't? Okay, nobody says no. How many of you say yes? Right, great. Why? Why do you think that we would invent that? What would sort of nudge us to invent adding that human touch to this historically always system-generated forecasts? Any thoughts? Sensibility, great, yes. Paul? Excellent, thank you. Any other thoughts? Yes, please. Sorry, I couldn't hear that last sentence, Fergus. Excellent. Thank you. Yes. Right. So the outside would sort of necessitate that need, is what you're saying. Excellent. Thank you very much. Any other thoughts? Yes, please. Yes. Extremely important, actually, isn't it? Thank you so much. Definitely, the liability and the ownership, the sense of control, yeah, external forces. Did I see another hand? Yes, please. So that information edge or information asymmetry could be incorporated, yeah? So those are all the reasons that you would think that we would invent it, right? Okay, let's keep that in the back of our minds as we go through what has been going on with AI and all the changes that's coming on. So let's keep this in sort of the back of our minds as we go through the talk. As I said, I'll start with AI and algorithmic advice. Now, to say AI has been game-changing is just doesn't do it justice, really, does it? It's a seismic change. You don't have to learn how to code things. You don't have to really have detailed knowledge. You can just ask whatever your platform you're using, whether it's Gemini or Copilot or ChatGPT, etc. You can upload files and ask it to come up with all kinds of codes, all kinds of forecasts. Take those, give it to another AI, ask it to criticize it, to improve it, etc., etc. The possibilities are endless, okay? But there are all kinds of other issues that come along with it. The algorithmic advice, as we used to call it for some time, has been subject to a lot of work, actually, haven't they? Algorithms are fast becoming a core part, an essential part of our lives in every aspect of our lives. So we're getting to use them all the time. We're becoming big consumers. It's becoming a part of our everyday lives. It's dominating a wide array of business applications, obviously, health applications, all kinds of cybersecurity implications, logistics, you name it. We have algorithmic advice everywhere. But research has shown that there is still a strong preference for human advice over algorithmic advice. So regardless of whatever system or AI or whatever generative AI system that this advice is generated with, people still prefer advice given by experts or humans in general. It could be collective wisdom of crowds, it could be specific individuals, and so on. That's a phenomenon that researchers have been referring to as algorithm aversion, and there's some evidence that suggests the exact opposite, that algorithms may be preferred at certain times, what's called the algorithm appreciation. In one of the first papers that we worked with Paul and Mary and Sinan and Andrew, what we did is we gave identical forecasts. We gave the historical time series information, et cetera, the background information, and an identical forecast to do two different group of participants, and told one that they were coming from experts, that they were human advice, and told the other group they were coming from systems, statistical methods, right? And even though the forecasts were identical, and these were financial forecasts, individuals took the advice that they thought was coming from experts a lot more seriously. They used that advice. They didn't change the forecast as much. They thought that was great. Same advice coming from statistical models, so to speak, was not regarded as highly at all. Again, even though they were identical forecasts. When we gave them forecasts available from two sources, advice that was believed to come from experts, the human advice, was weighted a lot more heavily, and the advice that was believed to have come from statistical models was discounted. So that was one very clear, very explicit show of algorithm avoidance. But the thing is, it's observed, we weren't the only ones who did this. We're one of the first ones, I think, that have shown it so clearly. But it's observed in a wide range of domains. So there's been recently a meta-analysis looking at 44 studies, over 122 tasks, about 89,000 plus participants. They showed algorithm aversion in 75% of the tasks, a huge percentage overall. Now, this raises very fundamental questions about the prominence of algorithms and how they're regarded. And of course, it accentuates a strong preference for judgment when it's coming from experts or human advice. That is listened to a lot more. That has a lot more credibility, it seems, when people are actually when they're actually adopting those forecasts and using them to make decisions. So if you were to start talking about the judgmental interventions in forecasting, as you have already said, that's a way of sort of giving the information edge, isn't it? So it's about the informational asymmetries and how you want to incorporate them, how you incorporate your intuition, experience, and so on. So why do people use judgmental interventions? Well, when we talk to forecasters, they say it's a natural response. When someone gives me a forecast, a system forecast, a generated forecast from somewhere, I make it my own. I have to include the information that I have that I don't think the model has. I have to put my stamp on it, if you will, right? So it's shown as, it's performed as a way of showing that you care about the forecast, right? The forecast is important to me, so I will make it my own. I will try to make a better job at it than the model forecast that I received. So it's seen as a channel for contributing to and complementing a given forecast. And as Paul rightly said, it's a means of controlling a forecast. That has been so important for practitioners that, you want to make it your own. You want to give a sense of control to it. And we do all that, forecasters do all that, just because they believe that it enhances the accuracy or informativeness or some quality that is important for decision making. And it's also seen as a way of creating a forecast story as well, right? So it's not just a mere number thing. There has to be a story behind it. And whether those forecasts have to do with financial forecasts, economic forecasts, healthcare forecasts, political forecasts, whatever, intelligence forecasts, etc., if there is a story, then it makes it a lot more practicable. It makes it a lot easier to communicate to people. It gives it a bit of a background, enhances the trust in those forecasts as well. So forecasters overall appear to be highly satisfied with judgmental approaches. because of the flexibility that it offers in integrating any kind of soft information that the model they think doesn't have, or anything that's recently happened, any changing conditions that you want to be responsive to and make sure that your forecast reflects such changes. Again, incorporating atypical situations, one-shot kind of situations. That's the way to do it. Adding a common sense element to the forecast, creating a sense of ownership in the forecast. There have been many situations when the forecasters were telling me, if I'm going to be blamed for the forecast, it might as well be, my own error, not some system's error, right? And yet, this depends, but in lots of different domains, we see there are poor adjustments that are being made. And why do they happen? Because we have all kinds of biases and fallibilities and so on. We overweigh our own information. We think we do know a bit more than what's gone into the model or the system. We read pattern into noise. We do a great job with that, actually. We treat each situation as a separate event when it really isn't. We don't keep error audits, or when we do, we're very good at rationalizing things, thinking this is a new kind of a condition that we haven't seen in the past. So we make rationalizations for not learning from feedback quite a lot. We have all these judgmental traps, obviously. We have the framing effects. We're very obsessed with quick forecasts. We have very selective recall and information use, resistance to learn from past errors. We have all kinds of biases, like desirability bias, and so on. That's on the forecaster side. What about the users of those forecasts? Well, the users adjust forecasts that are given to them for lots of reasons. Maybe the top is that they have an expected forecast in the back of their minds, and there are discrepancies when they see what they consider significant or substantial discrepancies or intolerable discrepancies, as the term might change, between the provided forecasts and what they expect the forecast should be. Then they may adjust them before using them for decision making. There are all kinds of communication gaps. Forecasting communication, the uncertainty communication, is a tremendously important issue. And when the communication channels aren't what the users think they should be, there are lots of adjustments coming in there. When there's lack of accompanying explanations or the stories, the background story, if you will, then they adjust them. There's always trust issues. We're going to come to that. There are all kinds of strategic biases, organizational factors we know. So what do the forecast users need? They need an acknowledgement of uncertainty, a very clear acknowledgement of uncertainty that is communicated in an unambiguous way, very clear, coherent, concise way. They also need, they tell us they need, alternative forecasts for different scenarios, right? So we're going to talk about how scenarios are related to forecasting, but this is one of the reasons why I got involved in scenario research. They don't just want one forecast for a particular point in time. They say they need alternative forecasts with their different uncertainties around them and the different contextual factors, different frames, and so on, that come from different scenarios. They need explanations for the forecasts and any prior adjustments that have been made. Typically, we see lots of nested adjustments in forecasts. So a system generates a forecast, forecaster tries to put their own stamp on it because they think they know things in addition to, and lots of times, very justifiably so, in addition to the information that's captured in the model. So the forecasters do some adjustment, and then the users also adjust. So we see this series of nested adjustments. And if we were to have some kind of explanations for the forecast and the prior adjustments, we see that those explanations actually make the final forecast perform a lot better. Users also would like flexibility for forecast revisions and rolling forecasts. They need information on these multi-tier or nested adjustments, and they want to be able to trust the forecast. And all the items that we talked about before sort of build onto that trust construct, really. So when we talk about behavioral considerations for judgmental adjustments, I think, one of the main takeaways that the practitioners tell us is knowing when not to make a judgmental adjustment is an acquired expertise. And it is tremendously important because a lot of research, Robert and Paul have done, for example, shows that lots of times when there are adjustments that are made, there is some deterioration in accuracy. Some of the work that I've done with exchange rate forecasters shows the exact opposite. So there could be a lot of training and contextual and how those forecasts arrive at. There could be lots of considerations around those. But knowing when not to make an adjustment is an extremely important awareness and a skill as well that the forecasters seem to acquire with expertise. Again, we have lots of studies that show if you are going to make adjustments, make sure they are structured as opposed to what seem like random adjustments or unstructured adjustments. The communication of uncertainty, as I said before, the explanations, the rationale that goes into forecast adjustments, the forecast format, and the way that any uncertainty that surrounds the forecast, and there will always be an uncertainty in different levels, but there will always be uncertainty, the way that it is communicated is extremely important. And forecasting format plays a huge role on that. Another behavioral consideration for forecast adjustments is actually the desirability of the outcome, the contradictory information, spurious relationships, and so on. They all build into different adjustments made with different qualities in the resultant final forecast and their transference to decisions. And one of the most important points, I think, is, what do people actually expect from forecasts? The forecasters typically have very different expectations from forecasts and what their KPIs are, if you will, their performance indicators are from forecasts, as opposed to the users of those forecasts. So what do people actually want? What does forecast accuracy mean? It's definitely not the only criterion that's important, and I believe Stephen Kolassa has a talk on that, so looking forward to hearing that. But who defines tolerable error? And who expects what? And can we somehow communicate those expectations to come up with forecasts that are much more meaningful and usable towards better decisions, really? And of course, trust is a very, very major construct in all kinds of behavioral adjustments in forecasts. So I'd like to spend a couple of minutes talking about trust here. When we talk about forecasts, or if you were to Google forecast, regardless of whether you're talking about economic forecast, financial forecast, political forecast, whatever, there's all kinds of criticisms about forecasting. I mean, we take the beating, don't we? It's like forecasters nobody likes, and it's like, they're just, there's a lot of uncertainty, and people are making these claims, and it is never correct, and so on. There's a lot of anti-propaganda, if you will, against forecasting accuracy. It's as if though all the forecasts are terribly inaccurate. People love talking about it, love criticizing it. And when something goes right and the forecasts are correct, nobody talks about those at that point, right? It's always the negative criticism we get about the forecasts in general. So trust has a lot to do with our feelings of vulnerability. It's because trust involves risk. Do we want to go ahead and think the forecasts are valuable? Do we want to adopt them for our decision making? Do we really trust them? Can we make ourselves that vulnerable? Those are quite important issues. Overall, we are very fragile when it comes to trusting forecasts and using them in our decisions. If we don't trust the forecasts, what happens is we change them, we ignore them, right? We just act as if though they don't exist and they're not important at all. But trust overall is the most important attribute that sells a forecast. So you might go through all kinds of hoops and hurdles and trying to come up with the best possible forecast that includes all the information there is, all, wonderful way of communicating it, this, that, capturing all the uncertainties. But if people don't trust those forecasts or trust you, then they just don't use it. So it is quite vital, shall we say. So trust is the most important attribute selling the forecast, and mistrust is a major barrier to collaborative forecasting, obviously, and benefiting from other perspectives, regardless of what context we're looking at. So we asked forecasters in different areas, what does trusting the forecast really mean to users of the forecast? How do users really find themselves trusting or not trusting forecasts? So they said things like, and these are direct quotes, they said things like, well, it's acceptance, really. You accept what's given to you. You use those forecasts without rechecking any of the assumptions, any of the data, etc. They kept saying it carries significant risk. There's a lot of risk involved in trust, so not for me. Being able to defend the decisions that are taken as a result, that was another meaning of trust. Trusting the knowledge, the experience, and the goodwill of the forecaster was, again, a very important item, that they had to believe there were no hidden agendas. They had to believe that there was very good intentions, no hidden agendas, no ill will, if you will. Trusting that they're not made to serve any personal goals, trusting objectivity of the forecast, the predictions, and the forecasters, being prepared for the forecasts to misguide you was another skeptical look. A must when you don't have time to do it all yourself, when you don't have time to gather your data, do the research, do the analysis, and so on. But there was always that skepticism coming up saying, well, it doesn't mean that you have to generalize that trust to other instances at all. It also meant tolerating the error in those forecasts, and it meant planning the conditions under which these forecasts may not turn out, really. So there was always that skepticism throughout. Trust in forecasts, according to a large survey we did, depended on lots of different factors. So people looked at and basically considerations that you would expect, like if they had any knowledge of the forecaster's expertise, any explanations were given, whether there were multiple methods used or a single method, whether there were any consensus forecasts given, which seemed to be very desirable in trust, past experiences, whether it was supported with scenarios, information on the forecaster, and so on. So trust is a very multidimensional construct. So we asked them, what can be done to enhance your trust as a user in the forecast. And they said, well, you have to give me a plan for revisions, right? So I have to know when the checkpoints are, when the rolling forecasts are made, what kind of information will be accumulated throughout the process, as well as, of course, a previous record of past successes and failures and the theory base and, forecasters' level of confidence in the forecasts and clear statement of all the assumptions and including the user input, all the things that you would expect. But one thing that kept coming up over and over again in these interviews was the definite need to see the scenarios underlying the forecast and the alternative scenarios and alternative forecasts that came along with it. That seemed to be a very major, very fundamental part of enhancing the user's trust in forecasts. So that brings us to the link to the scenario forecasting synergy. Scenarios are seen to be an important part of gaining the trust in the forecast user's eyes, right? So just the forecasts by themselves are not sufficient. They have to be communicated properly. The uncertainty needs to be communicated properly. And then the scenarios will need to be there as well. The different scenarios for different underlying conditions and the accompanying forecasts for each of those relevant scenarios. So I wanted to look at, basically, at that point, what were those scenario forecasting synergies? Scenarios are basically, they have been used in scenario planning for a long time. They offer structured storylines of plausible futures, what might happen in the future. They promote future-focused thinking. They offer collaborative pathways for information sharing. They facilitate the communication of uncertainty, the risks, the forecasts, and so on. And they provide a platform to formally recognize the uncertainties, which seems to be a tremendously important part of both the people who generate the forecasts and the users of the forecasts. So, in short, scenarios can be used as effective tools to challenge the mental frames and challenge the tunnel vision in decision-making, extremely important, hopefully yielding good decisions, winning decisions overall. Scenarios are also ways of combating different biases, like the confirmation bias, the hindsight bias, the overconfidence, the deliberate ignorance, the desirability bias, and so on. They counteract future myopia and retrospective sense-making, which happens a lot. Yeah. So it's quite convenient, shall we say, and quite human to go back and in time and try to make sense and rationalize different things. And when you have scenarios for different conditions under different assumptions, then you have grounds for basically stating all the different uncertainties that can happen, all the different conditions that happen, and what can happen as a result of all those constraints and the conditions under that. They support the forecasting process, and scenarios are ways of enhancing the trust in forecasts. Forecasters clearly tell us that in very different fields. And they enable forecasting agility as well, so that it's not like they get rid of that sense of pseudo-certainty, if you will, right? So there are different futures that can evolve, and different things under different scenarios may yield to such and such forecast or prediction intervals, etc., that are not just one for one particular scenario, but across a range of plausible scenarios. So that led us to some futures thinking research with scenarios in a very different field. So I know we'll be talking about business and economic forecasts throughout the symposium. So I wanted to talk about something a bit different. With Mandeep Dhami, we looked at a humanitarian crisis example. And we thought, okay, let's look at how the scenarios evolve there, okay? So intelligence analysis, it turns out, includes forecasting potentially important developments that are, of course, in areas of interest to decision makers and policy makers. This intelligence analysis also requires analysts to generate scenarios, right? Different scenarios for things like, what happens if there is a cybersecurity attack on the systems in the country and so on. What will happen if there's a new terrorism threat? What will be the health, economic, education, security, etc. consequences of continued migration to a certain country, from a certain country, etc. These are all the things that intelligence analysts deal with on a daily basis. And what they do use are what are called scenario-generating analytic techniques. So many intelligence organizations train their analysts to use different scenario-generating analytic techniques, things like cone of plausibility, simple scenarios, individual brainstorming, among others. And the whole idea behind these techniques is to encourage good practice and to avoid errors and all kinds of biases in thinking, as you can imagine. The thing is, they have been used in intelligence analysis, and all kinds of important decisions are made from everything from terrorism to cybersecurity to health to migration to everything else with these techniques. But the efficacy of these empirical techniques haven't been tested, which is what brought us to look at these techniques in more detail. And when we started doing this work, we had nothing to do with forecasts. That wasn't part of our work at all. We just wanted to see how we could use scenarios to basically forecast the potential outcomes of a refugee crisis, which was happening at that point in time very extensively in Turkey, and everybody was involved, and so on. So we focused on the effectiveness of just one technique, which is what I'm going to talk about here, the brainstorming technique. It was a series of studies that looked at different techniques. And we wanted to investigate basically what was happening, no forecast in the beginning, what was happening in the Syrian refugee crisis, what could potentially happen 6 months from now. So we examined different things. We gave particular scenario generating technique instructions, training to participants. Then we looked at different things like the quantity of scenarios generated, quality of scenarios, relationship between scenario quantity, quality, and so on. But what was interesting is that these scenarios that they wrote contained all kinds of forecasts. Now, that was not part of the plan at all. As I said, we did not start this to look at forecast scenario kind of synergies at all. We wanted to see what would happen with a certain scenario generating analytic technique. What would the scenarios look like? How were people happy with the scenarios they generated? What was happening to biases? We looked at a host of other things, but we didn't involve forecasts at all. It was only when reading the scenarios that people generated we saw there were forecasts in them, explicit forecasts in them. So we looked then at the nature of the forecast, the accuracy of the forecast, and so on. So this was quite some time ago, and we said this was the critical question that was given to participants. We just said, we want you to imagine that the Turkish government decides to ban all Syrian refugees from entering Turkey, effective immediately. This was done at a time when there were 2.5 million Syrian refugees in Turkey who registered Syrian refugees in Turkey. Now, of course, the numbers have skyrocketed. But we said, using the scenario generation technique you've been taught, we'd like you to think about the scenarios, as many as you can, that might occur as a consequence of this particular policy decision within the next 6 months. Right? And use your own knowledge. We gave them instruction sheets, we gave them background sheets, information sheets, and all that information was basically captured from reliable sources like BBC, World Bank, IMF, et cetera, et cetera. So the data we collected individually in one group took approximately 1 hour. They were instructed to generate forecasts, scenarios, again, with no mention of forecasts at all. So we had 40 participants who wrote 135 scenarios in total, ranging from 3 to 6 scenarios each. Nobody wrote less than 3 scenarios, and the most that was written was 6. And we assessed scenario quality by looking at different measures that is of concern in intelligence analysis, like the completeness, whether there's enough drivers, outcomes, assumptions. We looked at the context, whether they looked at social, economic, legal, political context, etc. We looked at the plausibility, the coherence, the order effects, and so on. So across the participants, there was no significant relationship between the number of scenarios that were generated and the median rating of each quality. So the scenarios were of very good quality overall. Just to give you an idea, 3 is high quality, and as you'll see, about at least 55% of the scenarios were of quite high quality when it came to coherence. Almost all of them were very highly coherent, et cetera, et cetera. So, it was quite a good set of scenarios that were generated. And then, as I said, in these scenarios, participants gave specific forecasts, things like it will affect the construction housing problem, the price will directly change. And then 6 months later, we got back to our, again, reliable news sources, and we looked at the evidence of, how the price of houses have changed, et cetera, et cetera. That's how we looked at what happened to the accuracy, among other things, of the forecast. And we looked at only the first scenarios that people have generated. We didn't have enough time to look at all the forecasts across all the scenarios. Remember, there was at least 3, maximum of 6 scenarios per person. Just the first scenarios contained a total of 176 forecasts, right? And up to 17, there was, I think, 1 person that had 0 forecasts given, but most of them gave it. And then we looked at the nature of the forecasts. We looked at the domain, whether they were giving economic, political, or social forecasts. We looked at the outcome direction. We looked at the detail, the precision, and the uncertainty, which was of great interest to us, whether they used uncertainty phrases or not, and how they communicated it. So, just as a quick summary, you'll see the percentage of the forecast breakdown according to these criteria overall. What was very important was the forecast accuracy. With these different scenarios, across the participants, more than 44% of the forecasts were found to be accurate, which was just, quite unexpected, really. And across the participants, there was no significant correlation between the number of forecasts that were provided and the average accuracy of the forecast at all. So once again, we started by asking people a question about an issue that was very important to everybody who lived in Turkey at that time, the refugee crisis. We asked them to come up with scenarios after basically giving them the training for the scenario generation technique. And then they came up with all these forecasts, and they were amazingly accurate in lots of different ways. They contained uncertainty expressions, they were very detailed, they looked at different contexts, etc. And so the accurate forecast, the percentage of accurate forecast by nature of forecast gives you that idea. Of course, there were some inaccuracies. But once again, I mean, 44% overall was just phenomenal. And if you look at the uncertainty expressions as well, that's quite a lot of them encapsulated the uncertainty communication as well. So what are some of the things that we're doing as a result of this, and what does it tell us? There's a lot of scope for strengthening the scenario forecast integration towards constructing better informed forecasts, reducing the biases in forecasts, and refined conversion of forecasts and risks into decisions. And using scenarios as a very important tool in that toolbox. And maybe most importantly, they're an important channel for effective communication of uncertainty, risks, and forecasts. And I think that is a very important direction that has been ignored quite a lot, that we would like to pick up, because it's so important to policymakers as well as forecasters, practitioners, and to decision makers overall across a wide range of spectrums. So we're working on different aspects of this work, basically of this research, trying to build collaborative pathways across stakeholders, basically towards enhanced uncertainty management and targeted forecasting and decision support. So what are some of the areas that can come up later with all the behavioral considerations that we talked about? Well, we're moving into this transient phase of human-machine integration into this human-machine partnership. And the smart selection and use of human input versus machine input is becoming extremely important. And all the different things we talked about over the last hour have very important repercussions for that. We're talking about informed assessments of relative advantages and strengths in different contexts and conditions of these. And with all the human-machine partnership work that is coming up, navigating through the ethics, the trust, the risk preferences, organizational politics, etc., is a very intricate domain, web of factors, isn't it? I mean, the EU AI Act is an important step in that direction, and lots of different acts like that are definitely to follow. But the future is just, it is one scenario after another, isn't it? There's a lot of uncertainty about the things that will happen as a result of this human-machine partnership, making the human input and the judgmental considerations and the scenarios and trust very important constructs. So the tailored combinations of these that are fit for purpose will definitely be important, and we hope that more work in these areas are forthcoming. So thank you for very patiently listening to all that. I have no idea of time because I didn't have a session lead, as it were. So any questions, or is it time for a coffee break? Or do you want to ask some now, ask more, follow up on later? What would you like to do? Any questions? Thank you, Robert. That's so kind. Thank you. Any questions? Yes. Sorry. Yes. million question, isn't it? There are lots of issues involved there. There will always be the effect of experience. I mean, we are just at the beginning stages of using Gemini, Copilot, this, that. Oh, sorry. We are at the very beginning stages of that. As we gain more experience, now there's a hype. Everybody wants to use it for everything, right? And then will come the trust, seriously, when people are trying to apply these things in real settings. I work with some health practitioners, for example, who are looking at different risks and trying to use some of the forecasts that they get from Copilot and Gemini and ChatGPT and GPT and so on. Once the initial hype is over, comes the actual questions and the trust issues. I think it will have to be a delicate balance. And I think that's why the human touch is going to be so tremendously important. We have to have it, but not for the kinds of skills that we used to have in the future, right? But for maybe different finessing and different questioning and different setting of the assumptions and different codes of questioning and the ethics that we give to the use of AI. So it's going to be an intricate web, isn't it, of balancing act, really. Thank you. That was great. Thank you. Any others? No? Well, they were conditional. They were all accuracies that were conditioned on the scenarios. So it wasn't making any expectations about which scenario would prevail, but it was about if scenario A was to prevail, what were the different forecasts that were given, and what were the different accuracy levels or uncertainty complexions, etc. on that. Yes. So, okay, the scenario that was given had all the different elements of different political, for example, statements, etc., etc. So it was not something that would definitely prevail or not in 6 months' time, right? So there could be different combinations of different elements through scenarios that could realize. But with the forecast that they made about house prices or the migration camps that were put in, the changes to the education system and so on, there was a total 0-1 kind of whether it happened or not. That was very clear cut. Whereas for the scenarios to be actually realized or not, that depended on a lot of factors. So we weren't trying to get an idea about the accuracy of the scenarios, if you will, if that makes sense. I understand what your question is. It's quite, everything is sort of conditioned on one another, isn't it? So yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you, Paul. Happy to discuss that further. Any others? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, the way that we look at scenarios and forecasts could be quite different than the way that scenario planners would look at them, definitely. And George has been tremendously supportive of this work. I just can't thank him enough for that. There was at a point where, people didn't want scenarios and forecast, the word scenario and the word forecast used in the same sentence. He has been extremely supportive with that, and that's how we got this work going and got the grants and so on and so forth. But you're right. I mean, it's in some of the situations, forecasts would have to do with the expectations of the people. It's sort of like the users sort of looking at forecasts about what they expect will happen or not, what as a sort of a justification mechanism sometimes for the plans that they are making, right? There's all the talk about, how executives set the forecasts based on their plans without looking at the other forecasts. So within the intelligence, within the security setting that we're putting at, you're right, it did deal with what the different the drivers that people were looking at, how they thought they would evolve. But what was very appealing to participants was to see that they were not stuck with just sort of committing themselves to one particular way of envisioning the future, but sort of thinking about different things that could happen, sort of like, depending on the different techniques, you could talk about wildcard scenarios or best case, worst case scenarios, etc., in different aspects. And as you said, some of the forecasts that came out had to do with their expectations, but some of them, like the housing prices, I mean, they wrote very elaborate scripts about what would happen and how the migrants would move from one city to another and would settle down in certain cities because of economical conditions and what would happen to the house prices as a result. So it was all a set of stories that led to different forecasts. So it was quite an interesting way to start looking at it. Thank you, Fergus. Yes? It depends on what kind of setting we're talking about, what the conditions are, and what the decisions you're trying to make as a result of it. But when I do any kind of consulting activity, my recommendation is to keep them. Just if for nothing else, for you to look back in time and to look at the different conditions and the scenarios you've generated and the forecasts that accompany them, or different judgmental forecasts that you generate given certain assumptions, and seeing what happens. Because in hindsight, as we know, hindsight bias is very powerful. In lots of times when you look back, you distort the reality, don't you? You just misremember things, or you conveniently forget certain factors, totally subconsciously, lots of the time. So having that kind of a track record to see how you envisioned different, a widespread array of uncertainties and how you sort of structured them, I think is tremendously important for you to learn from what you did in the past and what actually materialized. Lots of times, accuracy is just a minor component of what the users are looking at, right? So they're looking at a whole array of performance indicators. Accuracy is just one of them, whereas, we're sort of brainwashed, I think, into thinking forecasting accuracy is the one-all and so on. It's not. It's not, for lots of different reasons. Organizational politics, all kinds of strategic biases, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah. I think it's tremendously important to keep track of everything that you've done, regardless of what turned out at the end, to see how you have structured the uncertainties and how you communicated them so you can improve it for next time, so you learn from it. Yeah? Thank you. Thank you. Any others? Thank you so much. Oh, sorry. Yes. Sorry, I can't hear you. We gave them training on, yeah, using this particular technique, yes. Not really. We gave, this was only one of the set of studies we've done. We've done a huge set with different techniques that we gave training on each time. It didn't. There were just different ways for them to think about the leading drivers and the way they link to uncertainties and the outcomes. And they all were very comparatively accurate. With some of the techniques, they generated more forecasts than with some of the other techniques. So the forecast generation depended on the technique that was used. That was the basic difference. But the number of scenarios they generated and the different levels of uncertainty, expressions, etc., didn't basically change as a result of the technique. Thank you. I think I'm happy to continue that outside. Probably everybody wants to go on a coffee break. Well earned. Thank you so much. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you.